Second presenter is Moon Duchin. She's an associate math professor at Tufts University, leads the university's metric geometry and gerrymandering groups redistricting lab as well. So Moon, feel free to go ahead. I just wanted to give you an introduction because you deserve it. So.
Oh, thanks so much. Okay, I have some slides. Great. People's Commission. Now what? Okay, so let me start by saying that I'm really honored to have a chance to talk to this commission tonight. I think the work that you're doing is fundamentally important to democracy. And, you know, I'm here, I think of this as just a bunch of good news about new tools that help make it possible to do redistricting in ways that weren't possible just 10 or 20 years ago. So I'll pick up a little bit where Jordan left off, although you'll see in a few places I have a somewhat different view, and I'll try to bring that into focus. Okay, so here's what I want to do. I'm going to give you what I'm calling a short and opinionated tour of some ideas about drawing fair plans. What might that mean? How might we do it? How can these new tools kind of come into the picture? So I'll start with picking up again where Jordan left off, what I'm calling Computational Redistricting 101. So what are these ensembles and what do they do for us? Then I'm going to look at some examples with you. Look at Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Wisconsin, 3 states that have had a lot of attention paid to their redistricting in the last cycle, of course, as we know. The point that I'd like to develop is how you can sort of come to a framework of rules that lead you, that guide you as a deliberative body towards devising plans that are going to seem more fair to more people. I want to talk especially about something that's, I think, underappreciated and that is maybe feels the most distant from what computers can do for you, which is taking communities of interest into account. So taking sort of testimony from the public like you're doing tonight and figuring out how to take all that kind of local knowledge of you know, on the ground neighborhoods and communities, take that into account when you draw plans, and then putting it together into, and I like the way that Chris put it, a holistic framework. So if you only take one thing away from this spiel I've got for you here, I do hope it'll be none of what Jordan's saying, none of what I'm saying is a brief for outsourcing redistricting to the computers. We're not going to tell you that computers can draw better plans. They cannot. We're going to tell you how they can assist deliberative bodies like this in coming up with a framework and coming up with plans that live up to the goals that they set. Okay, computers. So what do they do for us here? So let's start with these ensembles that you heard about and what they're for. So the purpose of ensembles is to put districting plans in context. In other words, unlike the tweet that you saw from Jordan, the tweet came with an idea that your share of votes should be your share of seats. You'll hear that and a lot of other memes about fairness ideals. What is the most, what would be our expectation of perfect fairness? But the actual landscape doesn't work out the way some of those ideals and some of those formulas would have it. And so the point of ensembles is to see what else might have been done if we drew the plans in different ways. So tiny little bit of history. People have had the dream of doing this since at least the 1960s. You can start to see in the published literature a bunch of papers on what would happen if we just gave all the rules to a computer and let the computer run. But you know, that idea, that dream goes like this. You name the criteria, you write down formulas for all your criteria, you let the computer figure out all the possibilities, all the ways to make a districting plan, and then you look at your plan against that world of alternatives. That was the dream. That dream does not work. You can't do it. You would literally, on the most sort of science fictional, amazing, super galactic computer, you couldn't do it. You couldn't get all the possibilities until after the universe has collapsed in on itself. Can't be done. It's computationally intractable. But we can do something that's just as good, maybe better. Instead of trying to build all the plans, we can get a sample. And if we do it really nicely, we might get a representative sample from that whole vast universe of alternatives. And that's what we call an ensemble. It's like sampling plans from all the different ones that you could have drawn. So I'll tell you about some breakthroughs of the last 5 or 10 years in using random algorithms to kind of benchmark what can be done when you do redistricting. Okay, So how do these work? How do you build lots of random plans? So here are two animations that show you ways it could be done. On the left, there's a random process. So the colors here are the districts. I started out with these vertical stripe districts, and I'm flipping one unit at a time. You could think of that as like the wards in Wisconsin, which have to be assigned to a district. So maybe you're changing the district assignment of one ward at a time. And you could let that go for a really long time and draw random plans from this process. Or there's another way to do it, and this the second one that you see on the right here, something we've been working on in my lab for the last few years. This is called a recombination chain, and it makes much bigger changes to the map in each step. Takes two districts, merges them together, and splits them in a new way. And so you start to kind of lose the memory of your initial point pretty fast, and you get lost in the universe of plans, and getting lost is really good for drawing a random sample. Okay, so this is what we do to make plans. And now let me tell you a little bit about how that's featured. First, let me talk about litigation, although I want to emphasize these techniques are good for much more than lawsuits, but they kind of got a lot of attention in the last few years in the context of some lawsuits. So I'll tell you about Pennsylvania. So here's Pennsylvania, and here are 18 congressional districts. And then here's that recombination process, building new ways to cut up Pennsylvania into 18 pieces. I'll let that play for a minute. And the little units that you see here are the precincts. There's about 9,000 precincts in Pennsylvania. So I got a kind of front row look at this in 2018 when the congressional plan was invalidated by the state Supreme Court. Pennsylvania, like Wisconsin, is a state with split control. And the governor, Tom Wolf, brought me in as a consultant to help him think about what a fair plan would look like. So he was going to have a plan from the legislature to consider. And the question was, how should he evaluate it quickly? Okay, and so part of what you can do is you can build this big batch of comparators and then look at how a plan stacks up. So now let me drive home a point you also heard from Jordan. I'll emphasize the places where we agree. And that is proportionality just doesn't come for free. So Pennsylvania, like Wisconsin, is pretty close to a 50-50 state lately, you may have heard. Lots of attention on Pennsylvania's election, like Wisconsin's this year. So if you look at the Senate race from 2016 or the presidential race from 2016, both of those had a Democratic share of 49 point something, just less than half of the two-party share was Democratic. But if I build an ensemble by that exact process that you saw on the last slide, I go boop, 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 and it's very fast now. We've got this, I'll tell you, actually, yesterday we set a new speed record in the lab. We can now make 1 million plans in 8 seconds. True story. This is like dizzyingly fast now, okay? So you make all these plans, and that bell curve that you see, the histogram, like the ones Jordan was showing you, this is how many Democratic seats were in these totally partisan blind plans. You cannot accuse these plans of gerrymandering, right? All they were taking into account, and I should emphasize this, what were the rules that they were taking into account? One person, one vote, that's population balance. These were taking into account contiguity. You wanted each district to be connected. That seems like a pretty good districting practice. And so-called compactness, or kind of having reasonable shapes. Those things were kind of baked into the algorithm that we were using here. You might ask about all kinds of other criteria, and I'll talk about them a little bit more later, but this particular run was just population, compact, contiguous. And what does it show? It shows a pretty noticeable advantage, again, for the Republican Party. So Democrats have about half the votes, that's the red line, but the bell curve of outcomes is not that favorable to them, right? There's a few seat advantage for Republicans. Okay, so now let's see how that compares to some actual plans. So here are the plans that were made by the Wisconsin legislature, which in this case is Republican controlled. At this point, I want to issue a disclaimer. I think we all know this, but it's worth saying because in many of these examples, it'll be Republicans who made the maps. Both parties gerrymander, they absolutely do. Gerrymandering is an equal opportunity activity. There, I said it, and I believe it. Okay, but what happened in this case, so here's the plan from 2011, which you might recognize as one of those, I call it those shapes like tumors and fractals. It's got these erratic shapes. And there's the do-over plan from 2018 that the legislature produced in the process of the court case. And how do both of those stack up if you add up the votes? Well, I wrote 4, 6, and what that means is both of them If you compare them to how people voted for Senate, they give 4 Democratic seats. See 4 down here? It's in what you might call the invisible part of the bell curve. Okay, they're like as advantageous to Republicans as was essentially possible, right? But on the other hand, if you lay them over the presidential voting pattern, they give 6 seats for Democrats, which is a little more reasonable. Okay, and so you might infer from that they're designed to produce maximal Republican advantage in a Senate-like voting pattern, right? You might imagine. Okay, there were some other plans proposed at the time. So Governor Wolf, through a map-making consultant in a process I had nothing to do with, I was firewalled away from this process. They made a plan called the Governor's Plan, and the court appointed a special master from outside the state to come in and draw a plan. So that's the remedial plan or the court plan. And look how they perform. The Governor's Plan gives you 7 and 7 seats. It performs very much like a typical computer plan did, right? Sort of right in line with if you weren't paying attention to partisan data. The court plan's a little funny, right? It depends again which kind of voting pattern it is. So, Jordan said before, we just don't have a lot of ticket splitters. Don't tell Pennsylvania, because they do, right? This is what this is telling you. Even though you have roughly the same share of votes for the Democrat in these 2 races, and it's not just the same share, it's the same number. They're actually spatially located in different parts of the state. So Pennsylvania had lots of ticket splitters in this election. And as a result, this court plan, it performs pretty differently. Gives you 5 Democratic seats for the Senate pattern and 8 for the president pattern. And just for fun, this is an actual map submitted by a classroom of 8th graders as part of a homework assignment, true story. And they made a plan that does sort of pretty well in line with what this blind redistricting would do. Okay, let me pause here. Oh, so first, what was the outcome? Well, you all may know this, but the state court said, okay, we're not going to accept the legislative do-over plan or the governor's plan. We're going to take this remedial plan. So that court plan was adopted. And then 2018 was a bit of a wave year for Democrats. And the congressional delegation shifted from 13-5 to 9-9 under the new maps when it was voted on in 2018. So a pretty big shift. Okay, so this is a good point to say to you as we're thinking about what fairness would mean. Here, for partisan fairness, we have one idea, which is that fairness is proportionality. And then we have maybe this competing idea is that fairness is whatever would happen if you weren't paying attention to the partisan data at all. And I invite you to think about that. The answer is not clear. That's a question for deliberation. What do you think a fair map should do? And we'll come back to questions about how you might measure that in other ways. Okay, let's move to North Carolina for a moment and take a look at a similar scenario. So we want to get beyond this eyeball test. So the eyeball test is kind of one of the 2 ways that public attention ends up really focused on gerrymandering, I think. So one way is those disproportions like the tweet that you saw, and the other way is just ugly districts. People love to hate on ugly, malformed districts. So what are we seeing here? We're seeing the legislature's plan from 2012 in North Carolina, their do-over plan when it had to be replaced in 2016. And this is a plan made by a bipartisan panel of retired judges, a commission in a way, that included people from both sides of the aisle, knew North Carolina really well, and came up with this map here. Okay, so one thing I would say is your eyeball doesn't really distinguish, at least mine doesn't, between the do-over plan and the judge's plan. They both look pretty fine to me. And so we have to look a little closer to see what we think might be going on. And incidentally, here's what the ensemble tells us. Hey, the pattern holds up here. Even though we have very close to 50-50 voting, those computer neutral plans favor Republicans by a little. I mean, by a few seats, by a seat or so. But that, and let me say, I've been working on this for 4 or 5 years now. It's not always the case that Republicans get the advantage from neutral districting. There are exceptions. An exception is Virginia, which is a pretty purple state, also pretty 50-50, although getting more Democratic with every passing year. But Virginia is a state that had a pretty level playing field. Oregon's another state that doesn't have a huge advantage for Democrats and doesn't have a huge advantage for Republicans. So it's not always the case, but it is interestingly a trend in a lot of bright purple states these days that the neutral plans have a little bit of Republican advantage kind of baked in. All right, so North Carolina, what might you say? So this is an image from an amicus brief, the mathematician's brief for the Supreme Court that both Jordan and I were authors on. And it's like showing you forensically, you know, the David Lewis, who is in charge of the legislative subcommittee that was charged with making the maps in North Carolina. He said overtly, I tried to make a 10-3 map for Republicans. And he was asked, why make a 10-3 map with 50-50 voting? And he said, I couldn't see a way to get to 11-2. So no hiding the agenda there, completely overt. So here's how you do it. Here's how you'd make a 10-3 map. So what I'm showing you now is an ensemble of districting plans. And I'm showing you how much Democratic vote share there is in the district that's third best for Democrats or fourth best for Democrats. And here's what you can see. The 2012 plan and the 2016 plan have really tons of Democrats in the third best district. And then, oh, not quite enough Democrats to win the fourth best district. This is called packing and cracking. I know you've heard about this in testimony before. This is how you make a 10-3 map. Does that make sense? Right? And so the blue bell curves here are showing you that bulk of alternatives, and the judge's plan in both cases kind of hits the, what you might say is the meaty part of the bell curve. Okay. Again, I just want to emphasize this. I really don't want to sound as though I'm saying the fairest plan is at the top of the curve. I don't believe that. The curve's just showing you what would happen if you weren't paying attention to this issue. And maybe you want to be paying attention to this issue, right? But right now, what I'm talking about is you probably don't want to be all the way out in the tails of the curve. That's a sign that you were really kind of gerrymandering on the basis of what's being measured. Okay, so what about Wisconsin? So I'll refrain from, you already saw an image that had to do with the assembly map. I'll just show you the congressional map. So here's a picture of the congressional map in Districtor, which is some software I'll talk more about a little bit later. And I'll just say, like, Wisconsin follows the trend of close to 50-50 voting, and at the congressional level, some advantage towards Republicans. And, you know, sure enough, the status quo is a 5-3 congressional delegation. That was the case in the last election, and that occurred again in this election. And actually, only District 3 was very close. Most all the other 7 districts were not so close in the congressional election this time. Okay, so the current 5-3 congressional map is sort of in line with what you might see if you weren't trying to gerrymander. Okay, that's all I want to say about these ensembles. I really want to focus on thinking about how to use these techniques outside of challenges and litigation and lawsuits in court, how to use them as a commission that's trying to draw good maps. Okay, they're not just for lawsuits. So I want to kind of encourage you to embrace the bell curve here and use it for your advantage. How might you do that? So I would propose that ensembles can help you measure the impacts of different rules during the plan creation process. So they can help answer questions like this. How might you write a good competitiveness rule? Like, hey, maybe I looked at those congressional outcomes and I saw that only one district was competitive this time around. What if I wanted to draw a new plan that had more competitive districts? It's a thing you might decide that you want. You might ask, you know, we have the Federal Voting Rights Act that's in place and in force around the nation, at least for now, until the Supreme Court takes another look at it, perhaps. But you might ask, beyond your obligations under the Voting Rights Act, is there additional voting rights opportunity? Then maybe you're trading that off just trying to get one less county split. So a question you might ask is, how do the different goals and priorities that you have, how do they trade off against each other? And then, you know, the proportionality question is maybe the central one on a lot of people's mind. Why can't I get to proportionality? Like, could I, if I tried really hard, could I come up with a way, given the human geography of Wisconsin, is there a way to get closer to proportionality? So for me, you know, when I got into this, I heard all these different ideas of fairness. One person, one vote, no partisan advantage, reasonable shapes, you know, keep towns whole. We need electoral opportunity for minority groups, connected districts, and this most amorphous one of all, respect communities of interest. And what's often been done in the political science literature, in the law, in the litigation history, and, you know, often from my fellow mathematicians, is to turn these ideas into scores, into formulas, into tests or metrics. So if you haven't already, you will be overwhelmed with the panoply of different metrics that purport to measure those fairness ideals. So here is a collection of partisan fairness scores. And here are some metrics of shape, so compactness, right? And then here are some other things you can measure that try to get at some of those other principles. But what you'll see is that sometimes the fit is pretty loose between the score and the thing that it measures. So when I started out thinking about redistricting, thought there might be a lot of promise in just finding the better scores, finding the right scores, refining the scores, rebooting the scores. And I do still think that has some merit. But I've come to endorse a much more holistic approach that I'm going to be trying to describe for you now, that doesn't give itself over to scores and trust in scores to do the hard work for you. Okay. So let me show you a little bit what I mean. So I want to give you some examples. So my lab works with quite a few states to try to think about their rules. And for instance, in Virginia, they just passed a new constitutional amendment creating an independent commission. And in the process of putting that together, there were a lot of questions floating around about how rules would trade off against each other in Virginia. So here's a question you might ask. If you try not to split counties, but you also want to have nice shapes, are those two priorities harmonious, or are they fighting against each other? There's a map of Virginia that shows you the counties, and Virginia has this quirky system of independent cities. So those little dots in the middle, those are cities that function like counties. Okay. If you try not to break those up, are you going to tend to have nicer shapes or worse shapes? And so we did a study, and here's what we found. We built some ensembles, one that didn't care about counties, and another that was nudged to preserve counties, that was encouraged to build out of entire counties. And here's what we found. On the x-axis is a compactness score. If you're interested, ask me about it, but otherwise it's just some compactness score. And what we found is that actually the county preserving ensemble was more compact, not less, right? And so that's a way of answering the question, are these two priorities harmonious or are they at odds? This is saying they're actually harmonious. You can get better shapes and more county integrity all at once. They seem to work together. Does that make sense? Okay. Yes. Next example, let's look at Pennsylvania. So again, I was doing some consulting there, and at issue was partisan fairness. So we took a look at a lot of the partisan fairness metrics that are out there. One of them that's pretty popular, actually kind of made its name in Wisconsin, is the efficiency gap. Okay, whatever that is, we don't need to talk about what the score is, just to say it's a score where 0 is supposed to be fairness, and then positive or negative tells you which party is favored. So here's a little riddle for us, for me and my research group when we were trying to understand Pennsylvania real quick. Why was our ensemble seeming to favor, forget our ensemble. First of all, the plans that were being proposed, like the governor's map and the remedial map, why do they seem to have very Republican favoring efficiency gaps? As though efficiency gap thinks that the outside special master's plan is a Republican gerrymander. Why could that be? So the ensemble can answer that for you. So the gray stuff in this plot is the efficiency gap. Notice it doesn't have that usual familiar bell curve shape. It has some other funky shape. We could talk about why. But the entire ensemble is on the Republican favoring side of 0. So that's telling you maybe someone out there thought efficiency gap 0 should be fairness, but efficiency gap 0 is basically impossible in Pennsylvania. It basically doesn't happen, right? So this is another thing that ensembles can do for you. You can take a score and they can show you how that score varies in nature in your state. With your human geography and your political geography, what's a reasonable range for that score? And so if you look at this picture, what it's telling you is that kind of a typical range for efficiency gap might be about 10 points or even 12, 13 points in the Republican direction. And if you look at the proposed plans, you'll see the governor's plan, 538's Atlas of Redistricting, their compact plan, the remedial plan, and hey, it's those 8th graders again, all doing pretty well. Okay, so what the ensemble method is telling you here is that the efficiency gap universe might not be what you expected. Okay, I'll give you just one last example, which comes from Utah. So Utah was one of the states in 2018 that reformed its redistricting by statute, creating a commission. And they also became the very first state to take a metric called partisan symmetry and write it into the rules. So now it says that there's supposed to be a commission in Utah, and it's supposed to consider partisan symmetry, as it's supposed to kind of seek partisan balance through this score. And so we studied it, and here's what we found. This is a terrible idea in Utah. Please, Utah, don't do this, is what we found. And here's what I mean by that. So Utah isn't a 50-50 state, you may know, you may have heard. And in recent elections, it's been often something like 70-30 towards Republicans. And what we found is that if you enforce good partisan symmetry scores in Utah, it actually requires you to lock out Democrats from Congress. Even though there's the 4 seats, Democrats have about 30% of the vote. Proportionality says it'd be totally reasonable to have a Democratic seat. If you just enshrine partisan symmetry as your goal, you get a Democratic lockout automatically and, and necessarily. Okay, so this is like to the point from earlier about unintended consequences. This well-meaning rule in Utah would have unintended consequences. And that's something you can only learn by actually studying lots of alternative maps. Okay, so that was building a framework of rules. And so what I am trying to persuade you is that these kinds of tools of analysis can help you come up with rules that are well adapted to your state, to Wisconsin. But we haven't talked about public input, so let's talk about that. So Utah, to stick with Utah, did something really innovative in the last redistricting cycle. They broke ground by opening a public submission portal. I think it was like redistrictutah.com or something like that. And they asked the public, draw districting plans, submit them, and we'll consider them. So they were asked to draw congressional plans, legislative plans, and school board districting plans. Only a school board plan was adopted from the public input. Hey, but that's not nothing. Today, for the first time in this cycle, the tools for public submission have kind of modernized in such a way that you can take public input now pretty easily, not only in the form of districting plans, but you can also ask people to draw their communities. And here, I'll tell you a little bit about a tool built in my lab called Districtor. This is just a free public web tool. You can go to Districtor and it'll ask you, do you want to draw your community or do you want to draw a plan? And if you draw your community, it will ask you to draw a region. You'll paint in a region on the map. It'll ask you to name that community and then to give a narrative description about what are the shared interests of the people in that community. Why should that community be kept together to have a voice in government? Okay. There are other tools besides Districtor. So there's also, there's a tool called Representable. There's Dave's redistricting app does the districting side. Representable does the community side. I think Districtor is the only tool that does both districts and communities. But there's a lot of tools out there. District Builder is another, there are many. This really is an area that there's been a lot of development in the last 10 years. Okay, so why take public input in this form? Because first of all, it increases engagement, it increases legitimacy when you actually are seen to take public input into account. You can tap real diversity. I mean, as it is, this commission is quite diverse. It represents many parts of the state and many kind of axes of difference, but the state's a whole lot bigger and there's a whole lot more different kinds of folks in the state than can possibly sit on a commission. And you'd like to be able to hear from them all. So public input is a really great way to show people that they've got a voice, and to make that voice into something that you can work with in a concrete way, you really need software that's going to turn that input into something spatialized with a narrative that you can aggregate into a coherent whole. So I want to encourage you to think about possibilities for taking public input in map form and not just in narrative form, but spatialized narratives. Okay, how does all this fit together? So I'll just close these remarks with a model of an iterative process that kind of puts it all together. So what might you do? You might start with elections. So use Wisconsin data to scope out elections that illustrate voting patterns in the state. And here I want to say, let me kind of highlight the point I made earlier that I think it's not the case. I think you'll find when you start to look at a lot of different elections, it's not the case that there are, you should think of the people as Republicans or Democrats. You should really think of their votes as votes for Republicans, Democrats, or others. And that's because my experience now looking at data from a lot of different states, it shows that, you know, people's voting behavior is hard to predict. This is why the polls have had a hard time lately. It's hard to predict who will vote. It's hard to predict how they'll vote. And instead of building models that kind of, you know, guess people's votes for them, my recommendation to you is that you look at a suite of actual historical elections and you try to think about the ones that best illustrate the patterns you have in mind. Quick example, Virginia, again. Virginia is a state that has, of course, congressional elections in even years, but it has its statewide elections in odd years. And that means that if you want to, it's state level elections in odd years. And so that means if you want to model congressional voting, it might be good to use an even year election. But if you want to model legislative voting, it might be better to use an odd year election. There are quirks like that to do with sort of voting behavior. I live in Massachusetts, a very blue state, but we sure love our Republican governors, right? And so, you know, we had Mitt Romney not so very long ago, and Charlie Baker now. So if you were to look at the governor voting pattern, it would look very different from how we vote for president or senate. And this is something to keep in mind. Find a range of elections that illustrate the voting behavior you want to study. Next, deliberate. Deliberate about your goals, about the criteria, about the metrics. Then build a framework of rules and criteria that works for your Wisconsin goals, right? So in Utah, it would be partisan symmetry isn't going to have the impact that they thought it would have. So you should see how the rules you're considering play out in your state. Start drawing maps. Then take those first round plans, evaluate them against your criteria, consider their strengths and weaknesses. So for instance, maybe you make a plan and then you use ensembles to see where you fall on the range of possibilities for all your different criteria. What that will do is it'll give you a map of what your plan does well and what it doesn't do as well. And I want to emphasize, this is, does your plan live up to your goals, right? So this whole process that I'm outlining is about naming the goals and then trying to live up to them and seeing, am I sacrificing this goal to get a little more of that? That's this kind of iterative procedure that I'm trying to describe. Okay, and then by study demo plans, here's what I mean. If you find that your map is having trouble doing two things at the same time, these computer algorithms can also be used to try to find an example. For instance, can I get fewer county splits while still, you know, having a good compactness score? Use a computer, it'll come up with a plan. That plan's probably not a great plan to adopt, but it is a good plan to guide conversation. Well, how did the computer find an example that did those two things at the same time? Oh, maybe if we moved this line, it would have that process too. That's this kind of back and forth between you and the computer. Okay, draw new maps and repeat. Okay, this is a way to have the computer work for you instead of having the computer sort of do the job. All right, so that's all I want to say. Here's my email address, mduchin@mggg. And if you want to play with drawing plans, districtyear.org/Wisconsin is live. I encourage you to go try drawing your plans, try drawing your communities.